It was a calm afternoon at the busy airport. Passengers hurried through the gates, boarding their flights, while announcements echoed across the terminal. Among the travelers was Lieutenant General Anthony Caldwell, a highly respected officer in the Army. Though he wore casual clothes, a small military badge pinned to his chest hinted at his identity. Anthony walked calmly to his seat in the first-class section. He smiled politely at the flight attendants and nodded to the passengers as he settled into his spot by the window. The general didn't expect any attention. He was just a man traveling quietly after a long week of work. Little did he know, this flight would be anything but peaceful. Sitting a few rows behind him was Officer Mark Henderson, a plain-clothed police officer. Henderson glanced around the first-class cabin, his eyes lining on Anthony. At first, it seemed like just another glance, but Henderson's gaze lingered. His brows furrowed as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. The boarding process continued, but Henderson kept stealing glances at Anthony. Finally, as the plane was preparing for takeoff, he stood up and walked over to the general. His tone was sharp and accusing. "Hey," Henderson said, pointing at Anthony. "What are you doing here? This section isn't for people like you." Anthony looked up, surprised but calm. "I'm just here to travel like everyone else," he replied, his voice steady and polite. Henderson's eyes narrowed. "You don't look like someone who can afford this seat. What do you do for a living?" The other passengers turned their heads, sensing the tension. Anthony remained calm, refusing to let the officer's words rattle him. "I serve in the United States Army," he said simply, tapping the small badge on his chest. Henderson scoffed, crossing his arms. "Sure you do, and I'm the president of the country. Don't lie to me." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A flight attendant approached, her voice soft but firm. "Sir, please return to your seat. We're about to take off." Henderson ignored her, raising his voice. "I don't trust this guy. He doesn't belong here. Who knows what he's planning?" Anthony took a deep breath, staying calm despite the rising tension. "I have every right to be here," he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm asking you to please respect the other passengers and take your seat." The flight attendant tried again to de-escalate the situation, but Henderson's hostility didn't waver. Passengers started pulling out their phones, recording the incident as whispers of disbelief filled the cabin. Anthony remained composed, even as Henderson's behavior drew more attention. The atmosphere on the plane had shifted, and the calm flight Anthony had expected was now filled with unease. The flight crew was growing more concerned as Officer Mark Henderson continued to stand in the aisle, glaring at Lieutenant General Anthony Caldwell. The murmurs from the passengers grew louder, and a few whispered words of support for Anthony could be heard. Others simply stared, unsure of what to do. The atmosphere on the plane was tense, like a storm about to break. Anthony remained seated, his posture calm but firm. He had faced more dangerous situations in his life, and he wasn't about to lose his composure now. "Officer," Anthony said in a measured tone, "I don't want any trouble. I'm here to travel like everyone else. Please, take your seat." But Henderson wasn't ready to back down. "Travel like everyone else," he said with a mocking laugh. "I know someone pretending when I see it. You're not fooling me." He leaned closer, his voice loud enough for everyone around to hear. "You think wearing that little badge makes you important? Anyone can buy one of those online." Anthony's eyes met Henderson's, steady and unyielding. "This badge is not for show," he said calmly. "I earned it through years of service. I don't have to prove anything to you." The flight attendant stepped in again, this time with more urgency. "Sir," one of them said to Henderson, "if you don't return to your seat, we will have to report this to airport security. You're making other passengers uncomfortable." Henderson turned to the flight attendant, his tone sharp. "Uncomfortable? I'm just trying to make sure this guy is who he says he is. If something happens on this plane, don't say I didn't warn you." The flight attendant took a deep breath, trying to remain professional. "We appreciate your concern, but you're disrupting the flight. Please return to your seat." Meanwhile, some passengers had begun recording the interaction on their phones. The tension in the cabin was palpable. One man leaned over to whisper to his wife, "Why is he targeting that guy? He's just sitting there, minding his own business." A young woman across the aisle spoke up. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "but I think you're being unfair. He hasn't done anything wrong." Henderson turned to her, his expression cold. "Stay out of this. You don't know who you're defending." Anthony raised his hand slightly to calm the woman. "Thank you," he said softly to her, before turning his attention back to Henderson. "Officer, I think it's time you stopped causing a scene. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be." But Henderson wasn't ready to let go. He crossed his arms, staring down at Anthony with suspicion. "I'm not moving until I get some answers." The situation was spiraling out of control, and everyone on the plane could feel it. The captain had been informed, and the flight attendants were preparing to take more serious action. Anthony remained calm, knowing this was far from over. The tension in the plane was becoming unbearable. The murmurs of passengers had turned into uneasy whispers, and the once peaceful cabin now felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Officer Mark Henderson stood in the aisle, glaring down at Lieutenant General Anthony Caldwell, unwilling to back down. The flight attendants had tried to intervene, but Henderson's defiance only seemed to grow stronger. Anthony remained seated, his face calm, though his mind was racing. He had been through tough situations before, but this one was different. He wasn't used to being threatened while simply trying to travel. The last thing he wanted was trouble, but the officer seemed determined to create it. "Officer," Anthony said in a controlled voice, "I've asked you to stop. Please return to your seat. You're making everyone uncomfortable." But Henderson didn't listen. His hand twitched at his side, and suddenly, the unimaginable happened. He pulled out a gun from his holster and aimed it in Anthony's direction. The cold metal of the firearm glinted under the overhead lights, and the cabin fell silent. Gasps filled the air. Some passengers froze, unable to believe what they were seeing. Others instinctively ducked, seeking safety behind the nearest seat. The air felt thick with fear, and even the flight attendants seemed frozen, unsure of how to react. "Stay where you are," Henderson barked, his voice trembling with a mix of anger and fear. "I'm in charge here now." The plane's captain, who had been informed of the escalating situation, made a decision. He immediately ordered the crew to call for security, and the flight attendants scrambled to execute the emergency protocol. But Henderson's gun was still trained on Anthony, and every second felt like an eternity. Anthony's mind raced. He had never imagined a flight could take such a dangerous turn, but even in the face of the gun, he didn't lose his composure. Years of military training had taught him how to stay calm in high-pressure situations. "Officer," Anthony said, his voice calm but firm, "you don't need to do this. I'm not your enemy. Just put the gun away and let's talk this through." But Henderson wasn't listening. His finger was on the trigger, and his eyes were wild with a mix of fear and anger. The officer's breath was heavy, and his whole body seemed to tremble as he kept the gun pointed at Anthony. Anthony could feel the eyes of every passenger on him. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was becoming a spectacle. He needed to do something. "You're scaring everyone on this plane," he said quietly. "This isn't the way to handle this." The tension only increased. Some passengers began to speak up, urging Henderson to lower the weapon, but the officer was too far gone in his anger. The situation was spiraling out of control, and Anthony knew the flight attendants were trying their best to handle it. Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed down the aisle as airport security began to board the plane. They had been alerted, and they were here to end the standoff. Henderson, still shaking, turned toward them, the gun slightly lowering as he noticed the armed officers entering. But the damage had already been done. Anthony remained seated, his eyes never leaving Henderson. The situation was tense, but the officers quickly took control, disarming Henderson and pulling him away from the scene. The gun was no longer aimed at Anthony, but the fear still hung heavy in the air. The tension in the cabin had not yet settled. The moment Officer Henderson's gun was taken from him, the entire plane seemed to exhale a collective breath. But the anxiety lingered. Passengers remained in their seats, their eyes wide and filled with concern. Some still had their phones raised, recording the whole incident, while others whispered in disbelief. The calm atmosphere that should have marked the start of the flight was now replaced by a heavy silence. Anthony Caldwell, however, was still seated, his face composed despite the chaos that had just unfolded around him. His training in the Army had prepared him for dangerous situations, but this was different. He had never imagined that a simple plane ride would turn into such a dangerous confrontation. But through it all, he kept his demeanor steady. As the security officers escorted Henderson away from the scene, one of the flight attendants approached Anthony cautiously. She looked relieved but still wary. "Sir, are you all right?" she asked softly, her voice betraying a mix of concern and exhaustion. "I'm fine," Anthony replied, his tone calm. He had learned long ago how to stay composed in high-stress situations. "Just shaken up, but nothing I can't handle." The flight attendants exchanged looks of relief, but one of them, still visibly nervous, glanced around the cabin. "We're going to need a moment to make sure everything's okay," she said. "Please stay seated for a few more minutes." Anthony nodded, respecting her request. He wasn't in a hurry to leave his seat just yet. The whole plane had been shaken by the incident, and it wasn't just the flight crew that needed to regain control. The passengers did too. He knew the crew would handle the rest of the situation, but the calm would only come when everyone on board felt safe again. As the minutes passed, the captain came out from the cockpit. He made his way down the aisle, stopping briefly to speak to the flight attendants. When he saw Anthony, he paused. "Lieutenant General Caldwell," he said, his voice filled with respect. "I'm so sorry about all of this. I can't imagine how this must feel." "It's not your fault," Anthony replied, giving the captain a reassuring smile. "You handled it well. It was just an unfortunate situation." "Still," the captain said, his tone sincere, "we'll be filing a full report on this, and I promise you, we'll ensure everything is dealt with properly." Anthony nodded, grateful for the captain's professionalism. But in his heart, he knew this wasn't about paperwork or reports. It was about making sure something like this never happened again. He couldn't shake the thought that Henderson's actions weren't just a random outburst, but part of something bigger. As the plane finally began to taxi down the runway, Anthony sat back in his seat, his mind racing. He had been threatened, humiliated, and put in a dangerous position by a man who should have been a protector of peace. But despite it all, Anthony was not rattled. He had faced much worse before and survived. The most important thing was that no one had been hurt, and the flight would continue safely. As the plane ascended into the sky, Anthony looked out the window, his thoughts drifting back to the many battles he had fought in his life, both on and off the field. This was just another test of his resolve, and he would not back down. The moment Officer Henderson was escorted off the plane, a wave of relief washed over the passengers. But the quiet wasn't restored immediately. People were still talking in hushed voices, processing the shock of what had just happened. It was clear that no one would forget the terrifying moment when a police officer had pointed a gun at a man who had done nothing wrong. Anthony Caldwell, still calm despite the chaos, watched as security personnel moved through the cabin, ensuring everything was in order. The crew had done their best to maintain control, but now it was up to the professionals to take over. As the flight attendants worked to reassure the passengers, a few came to speak with Anthony. One of them, a young woman named Sarah, bent down next to his seat. "Sir," she said quietly, "I just want to thank you for staying so calm. We were all a little scared, but you kept your composure, and that helped everyone." Anthony smiled faintly, appreciating the kind words. "I'm just doing my job. Staying calm is important in situations like this." Sarah nodded, still a little shaken. "I don't know how you did it. If it were me, I don't know if I could have stayed so calm." She looked over at the security officers who were now speaking to other passengers. "I hope he gets the help he needs." Anthony turned his gaze to the officers, who were interviewing people and gathering evidence. "I'm sure he'll face the consequences of his actions," he said quietly. "But it's not about him anymore. It's about making sure this doesn't happen again." The conversation was interrupted by the captain, who came down the aisle once again. This time, he was accompanied by a senior security officer. "Lieutenant General Caldwell," the captain said respectfully. "I wanted to personally apologize for what happened. We've already contacted the airline security team, and they'll be handling the next steps. You're safe now." Anthony nodded. "I appreciate that, Captain. I just want to make sure no one else has to go through what I did today." The security officer, a tall man with a serious demeanor, looked at Anthony. "We'll be conducting a full investigation. The officer's actions were completely unacceptable. Rest assured, this will be taken seriously." As the conversation continued, the rest of the passengers were settling into their seats, some still glancing over at Anthony, who was at the center of this unexpected drama. Some whispered their thanks, while others simply nodded, still unsure of what had just unfolded. But one thing was clear: Anthony had earned their respect that day. The flight finally took off, and the plane began its smooth ascent into the sky. Though the incident had shaken everyone on board, the crew quickly returned to their duties, and the mood in the cabin began to settle. However, the faces of the passengers reflected the unease they felt, and many couldn't stop talking about what had happened. In the quiet moments, Anthony couldn't help but think about what would come next. There would be an investigation, and there would be consequences. But more than that, he wondered about the larger picture. What had driven Officer Henderson to act this way? And how could society prevent this kind of behavior in the future? But for now, Anthony was safe, and the flight continued. He leaned back in his seat, looking out the window, as the world outside seemed vast and peaceful. Inside the plane, though, the ripples of the earlier incident would stay with everyone, in one way or another. By the time the plane landed, the tension had begun to fade. The flight attendants went through their usual routines, making sure everyone had what they needed as the plane taxied to the gate. But as the doors opened and passengers began to disembark, the air was still thick with the memory of what had happened just hours earlier. The incident with Officer Henderson had shocked everyone on board, but little did they know, it was just the beginning of something much bigger. As soon as Anthony stepped off the plane, he was greeted by airport security and the local police. The airline had taken swift action, notifying the proper authorities about the situation. Anthony spoke briefly with them, recounting the events with calm detail. They thanked him for his cooperation and told him they would continue to investigate the incident thoroughly. But what Anthony didn't know was that the story had already begun to spread far beyond the airport. As soon as the plane had landed, passengers had started posting about the incident on social media. The videos they had recorded during the confrontation quickly went viral, showing the shocking moment when Officer Henderson had drawn his gun on a calm and composed Anthony. Within minutes, the hashtag Justice for Caldwell began trending. News outlets picked up the story fast. Major television networks, online publications, and local news stations all began to report on the incident. Some focused on the shock of a police officer drawing a weapon on a military officer, while others dug into Henderson's background, searching for any signs of previous misconduct. The video clips were shared thousands of times, and people around the world began to voice their opinions on what had transpired. Many of the comments were supportive of Anthony. People praised him for staying calm under pressure, with some calling him a hero. Others expressed outrage at Henderson's actions, demanding justice and accountability for his behavior. Online communities started calling for police reform and better training for law enforcement officers. It seemed like everyone had something to say. For Anthony, the attention was overwhelming. He had never expected such a response to a simple act of traveling. While he was grateful for the support, he felt uncomfortable being the center of so much media attention. He had always been a private person, focused on serving his country and keeping a low profile. Now he found himself in the middle of a national conversation. As the story spread, more details about Henderson's past began to emerge. He had a history of complaints against him, including accusations of racial profiling and misconduct. People began to question how someone with such a background had managed to keep his job as a police officer. The public outcry grew stronger, with many demanding that he be held accountable for his actions. But amid the fury and public debate, Anthony remained quiet. He didn't want the focus to be on him, but rather on the larger issues the incident had raised. He knew the attention was necessary, but he didn't want it to overshadow the real message. He wanted people to understand that no one should ever be made to feel unsafe or threatened for simply going about their day. The focus in his mind should always be on creating a safer, more respectful society for everyone. As the media frenzy continued, one thing was clear. The story of what had happened on that flight had sparked a conversation that would not soon be forgotten. The days following the incident on the plane were filled with intense scrutiny. News outlets continued to cover the story, and the public reaction grew stronger by the hour. But behind the headlines, a serious investigation was unfolding. Anthony Caldwell was now at the center of an inquiry that would not only focus on the actions of Officer Mark Henderson, but also on the practices within the police department itself. It didn't take long for Henderson to be suspended. The police department, facing mounting pressure from the public and media, announced that he would be placed on leave pending the results of the investigation. The news hit the media almost immediately, adding more fuel to the fire of public outrage. People wanted to know why Henderson had acted the way he did and whether his behavior was part of a larger pattern. The department also began to dig into Henderson's background. It wasn't long before reports emerged showing that there had been multiple complaints about him in the past. Some of the complaints were related to racial profiling, while others involved aggressive behavior towards civilians. The most troubling part of all was that despite these complaints, Henderson had continued to work as a police officer without facing any serious consequences. As the investigation moved forward, more people began to speak out. Former colleagues of Henderson's shared their own stories of unprofessional behavior, and some even claimed that he had a history of making derogatory comments about people of different races. It was clear that his actions on the plane were not an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern of troubling behavior. For Anthony, the situation was complicated. He was grateful for the public support he had received, but he didn't want to see Henderson's career ruined. He believed in second chances and wanted to see justice served, but not through harsh punishment alone. Still, he knew the public's outrage was understandable. Henderson had put lives at risk, and that was something that could not be ignored. As the investigation progressed, the police chief held a press conference to address the situation. Standing before the cameras, he apologized to Anthony and the public for Henderson's actions. "What happened on that plane was completely unacceptable," the chief said. "We are committed to making sure this type of behavior is never repeated, and we will be implementing new training and policies to ensure the safety and respect of everyone, regardless of their background." The police chief's words were a step in the right direction, but many felt that they were not enough. Calls for reform in law enforcement continued to grow louder, with many demanding changes to the way officers were trained and held accountable. People wanted to see action, not just words. For Anthony, the public conversation was becoming less about him and more about the larger issue of accountability in law enforcement. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but he was hopeful that the events surrounding the flight would spark a meaningful discussion about how to create a safer and more respectful society. As the investigation into Henderson's actions continued, the fallout was still unfolding. It was clear that this incident had uncovered deeper issues within the police department, and only time would tell how they would be addressed. The investigation into Officer Mark Henderson's actions continued for several weeks, but it became clear that the outcome was inevitable. The police department, under immense pressure from the public, the media, and the ongoing investigation, announced that Henderson's employment would be terminated. The decision made headlines across the country, as many felt it was a step toward accountability in law enforcement. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some people applauded the decision, feeling that it was necessary to show that such behavior would not be tolerated, no matter the position or background of the person involved. Others, however, argued that firing Henderson alone was not enough. They wanted to see broader changes within the police department, including better training and a stronger system of checks and balances to prevent future incidents. Anthony Caldwell, ever the calm and composed figure, spoke out about the decision. He expressed his belief that while Henderson needed to be held accountable for his actions, it was important to look beyond one individual's mistakes. "This isn't just about one officer," Anthony said in a public statement. "It's about creating a system that ensures everyone is treated with respect, no matter who they are or where they come from." Anthony's words resonated with many, and his call for change became a central part of the ongoing conversation. The case had highlighted serious issues within the police force, and people began demanding that those issues be addressed. For some, Henderson's firing was just the beginning, a sign that larger reforms were needed to create a more just and equitable system. Despite the controversy surrounding the firing, the police department took additional steps to rebuild trust with the community. They announced plans to implement mandatory sensitivity and bias training for all officers, as well as new policies aimed at preventing the kind of behavior Henderson had exhibited. The department also promised to review its procedures for handling complaints and misconduct, making sure that no officer with a history of problematic behavior would be allowed to continue serving. Anthony Caldwell, meanwhile, continued to focus on the positive impact that the incident had brought about. He knew that one act of courage, standing firm in the face of injustice, had sparked a much-needed conversation about respect, accountability, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. While the journey toward change would be long, he felt hopeful that this incident had served as a wake-up call for many. In the weeks that followed, Anthony became a symbol of resilience and integrity. His calm demeanor in the face of danger and his commitment to fairness earned him respect from people across the country. He spoke at events about leadership, accountability, and the need for reform, urging others to take action in their own communities. As for Henderson, his firing was a reminder that actions have consequences. The officer had lost his job and the public's trust in a single moment of poor judgment. But the broader lesson, as Anthony had pointed out, was that lasting change would only come when systems of power were held to the same standard of accountability as individuals. The story of what happened on that plane, from the shocking confrontation to Henderson's firing, would stay in the public's memory for years to come. It was a story about courage, about standing up for what was right, and about the power of one voice to make a difference in the world. The months following the incident on the plane were filled with reflection and change. The investigation into Officer Mark Henderson's actions had sparked a public conversation about accountability, respect, and justice. As the story faded from the headlines, the impact of what had happened continued to shape the way people thought about law enforcement and the treatment of others. For Lieutenant General Anthony Caldwell, the journey wasn't over. While the media coverage had died down, the lessons learned from that fateful flight remained with him. He believed that the real change had to come from within, from understanding how small actions could have a ripple effect on society as a whole. He knew that people could only make a difference when they decided to act, just as he had done when faced with the challenge in the airplane. In the months after the incident, Anthony continued to speak at events and participate in discussions about leadership and the importance of integrity. He was invited to give talks at schools, military bases, and community gatherings. His message was clear: standing up for what is right, even in the most difficult situations, was essential for building a better world. "I didn't want to be the center of attention," Anthony said at one of his talks, "but sometimes doing the right thing means stepping into the spotlight. It's not about fame or recognition. It's about making sure everyone feels safe, respected, and valued." Many of the people who heard Anthony's story found his calmness and resolve inspiring. It was a reminder that courage wasn't always about big, dramatic moments. Sometimes it was about remaining steady when everything around you seemed to be falling apart. In the wake of the incident, police departments across the country took a hard look at their policies. Many began revising their training programs, focusing more on de-escalation techniques, cultural sensitivity, and making sure officers understood the consequences of their actions. Henderson's firing had sent a message to law enforcement. No one was above accountability. But it was also a signal to the public that they could demand better from the systems meant to protect them. Public opinion began to shift as well. Many people started speaking out more, advocating for reforms in the justice system. While there was still a lot of work to be done, the conversation had begun. People realized that they didn't have to accept things as they were. They could push for change, just as Anthony had done by standing his ground on that plane. In the end, the most important lesson from the ordeal was the power of one person's actions. While it may seem small in the moment, a single act of courage can inspire an entire community to take action. The flight incident had begun as a moment of fear and conflict, but it had transformed into a movement for change, led by a man who believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. As Anthony looked back on the events of that day, he knew that the journey wasn't over, but he also knew that he had played a part in something bigger than himself, something that would hopefully lead to a future where respect, fairness, and accountability were at the forefront of everyone's mind.